This module focuses on the importance of data for legal research, and this stems from the importance of facts for lawyers, generally speaking. We live in an era where our relationship to information is changing. We've moved from a society where we basically receive information that we trust from experts to one where we're now constantly assailed by different sorts of information, different facts, figures and claims, and we need a foundation by which we can evaluate and understand that information. And this has always been a problem when we talk about common sense facts, and there's always been a need to look very closely at these and re-evaluate them and just determine whether something that everyone thinks is common sense is in fact true. And in fact, this might be the very foundation of research methodology, is the opportunity to debunk what the common sense belief is and to show that there's actually something more complex going on. And the majority of legal processes and things that lawyers do rely on this bedrock and foundation of fact. In fact, we have our own method of describing facts and truth, and that's the law of evidence. And it's interesting that the law of evidence has always described truth in terms of the best possible version of the truth as supported by evidence. And it's a kind of approach that we have to come to as well when we're looking at truth and facts about the real world. We may never know an absolute truth, but we can make a value judgment based on the best evidence we have to hand and the best proof we have. And this is in stark contrast to the spread of fake news and disorder, where people will believe what is the top of a Google search list or something that is fed to them through social media, through channels that they agree with, rather than actually look at the foundation of those claims. So in this area, we differentiate between quantitative data, which is facts, figures and numbers, and qualitative data, which is basically everything else. I'm not sure what sadist decided to use two almost identical words to describe the different sorts of data, but it's what we're left with, and it undoubtedly will cause confusion, has in the past and will in the future. So quantitative data is about the facts, and it answers very specific sorts of questions: who, what, where, why, when. Those very pointed factual questions. Qualitative data, on the other hand, which tends to take the form of words and opinions and interviews and discussion, gets at a different sort of answer, or a different sort of fact, and that's the how, it's the why. How did this take place? Why did this take place? And most research requires both. Organisations tend to prefer quantitative data because it's nice and simple and it's easily transferred, easily communicated, and it looks nice and neat on a graph. But in most circumstances, it's the tip of the iceberg, and you really need the qualitative information to dig deeper and find out. So even a very simple question of, what's your opinion on this particular thing on a scale of 1 to 10, we can get an average of what people think, but we probably need to know why they think the things they think. We need to understand it more, and the numbers don't just give us that. So how is this information relevant to lawyers in all the different forms of legal practice that there are? Well, here's a few examples of situations where it does become important. Keeping of statistics in any regulatory system is important, and we see it most clearly in law enforcement, particularly around criminal law. So we can look at crime rates, we can look at conviction rates, we can look at what sorts of crimes were committed. We can map them over time, we can see trends over time, we can map them over space, we can see high crime areas. So there's a great deal of quantitative information that's kept as the regular review of regulatory systems, and criminal justice is pretty much the most obvious one. We also, in law, now use regulatory impact statements when we change the law. So we want to understand what the law is and how it's been operating and why we need to change it. And that has a composite of qualitative and quantitative data in it. It generally takes a form of a report that examines the way in which something has been operating. Forensic evidence is used, and again we tend to think about crime, but there's no reason why forensic evidence isn't used in other areas of law as well. And that again has a mixture of the quantitative information, which is the what blood type was it, what percentage of alcohol was in the bloodstream, and the more qualitative information, given that these insects were growing in the corpse, how long was the corpse likely to be there? I mean, it's going to have something that has a figure attached to it, roughly, 24 hours or whatever is what the forensic entomologist says. But this involves a lot of evaluation of complex data that cannot necessarily been reduced to a number. We often also see an emerging field of visualization of forensic evidence, and this is quite contentious and controversial, but it's something to keep an eye on, where particularly in the United States, of course, there's the trend towards showing, computer modelling of bullet trajectories in order to prove or disprove something around a particular crime scene. And that's another example of data handling. We also see, and we have very recently, when I'm making this video, discussions around law reform and public opinion, where the public opinion is being canvassed through various instruments. And an understanding of qualitative and quantitative data helps you evaluate the validity of those instruments and the findings of those surveys. We also use a lot of data in economic analysis, particularly in analysis of functioning of programs, and most of you will probably end up in a situation somewhere along your career where you have to work to a budget. You have to be able to analyse figures, you have to be able to analyse money, where it comes from and where it goes. Risk assessment is another area that's very important, and again that has a strong quantitative basis. Demographics can help us understand the way in which people use the justice system. So there's a wide variety of different ways in which lawyers use quantitative and qualitative data every day in their practice. Now, it may seem that the traditional, what we call the doctrinal approaches to legal research, don't involve a lot of analysis of qualitative and quantitative data. And that's, I think, primarily because that form of research uses its own terminology and its own approach, and it seems to operate in a different way to other forms of academic research, but I don't think things are that far apart. I mean, law reform is clearly an area, because it's so interdisciplinary, that relies on both an analysis of what the legal authorities have to say, but also on the qualitative and quantitative data about, well, how does the system work? What are the problems? What are the issues there? Precedent, understanding precedent, is a fundamental form of qualitative analysis. Qualitative analysis is about the text, understanding meaning in the text, whether it be a transcription of an interview or whether it be a judge's judgment. What we're looking at in that process is understanding what those words mean. And I think it's not too far a stretch to say that the conventional doctrinal notion of precedent analysis may seem to be in a separate category to the sort of qualitative analysis or ethnography that people do in the social sciences, but they use a lot of the same tools. And in fact, some of the theorists, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of legal hermeneutics and understanding what people say about what legal judgment, analysis and meaning is, draws very heavily on other disciplines, particularly theology and philosophy. Legislation, again, is a form of textual analysis, but it also has this mechanistic element of it that's almost like software engineering, of being able to understand how systems work, how they fit together, how one piece fits with another. And again, this relies on data. This relies on an understanding of, first of all, on that qualitative level, what each of these pieces of the puzzle mean. But often then it has a quantitative element when you come to look at the reason why legislation is being implemented. What's the problem that it's being designed to overcome? And often there'll be some facts and figures underlying that, and what the need was which drove the legislature to create that legislation. Client interviewing, again, client interviewing or research subject interviewing are both qualitative process, and I think one way to get better at client interviewing is to read up on some of the material on interviewing in the social sciences, interviewing in anthropology, interviewing in sociology. It's full of interesting tips and ideas that I think are relevant to lawyers as well. And of course, there's a whole lot of numerical work that goes on as part of everyday work in law, even in the core parts of the legal profession. There's billable hours, there's trust accounting, there's taxation of costs. There's all sorts of things that go on that require an understanding of figures and require you to actually understand how numerical data works. So hopefully that's convinced you that far from being something which is remote from legal research, that data analysis is something that we do. It's just often something that we call by different phrases, and we try, and that somehow, I think, distorts the fact that what we're doing has more in common with what other researchers do than it has different. So how do you get better at handling data as a lawyer? Well, I think one thing you can do is to read widely and not to confine yourself to just reading things or watching videos around the law itself. Look at other issues. I've referred in the notes, and we'll put a link in the below to the excellent online video series on calling bullshit in the age of big data. Fantastic series of videos that looks at data analysis and gives you some really, really useful foundation for understanding that. But there is all sorts of useful material, in print and on YouTube that can help you become better at using data. I would also suggest that wherever possible you participate in practical activities such as law reform activities. I know that's a fundamental platform as part of this course, is that we look at law reform because it uses all the different research skills. But because of that, don't, when you finish studying this particular unit, put everything aside and say, well, I'm not worried, I'm not going to worry now till I graduate. Make sure you regularly engage in things that ask you to use those research skills. It might be law reform, it might be other projects, but look at practical things as well. Don't just think about writing assignments and completing exams as all you need to do to be a good professional lawyer. And I would also suggest looking closely at other fields, such as criminology, which is very closely related to law, but has a different approach and uses, and because it's based very heavily in sociology, it uses a lot of social science research methods. And being able to understand the similarities as well as the differences between these approaches, I think, is very important. It's one thing there, I have my Master of Laws is primarily a degree in criminology. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a master's to you. I think there are better ways to go, but I do not regret the experience because it gave me a strong foundation in a discipline other than law and a different way of looking at problem solving. And you'll see how so many of the ideas are consistent, but occasionally you'll hit ideas that are divergent. So criminology, and particularly around crime prevention, tends to be very pragmatic. It comes out of the positivist approach, and it doesn't tend to really emphasise ideas like rights. And often there is a lack in the material that's written because the bottom line for people in criminology is crime prevention and it's the outcomes. Whereas for lawyers, we also have that importance of the process along the way to ensure the process is just and respects people's rights as well. So there's an interesting fusion that happens there. So there you have it, qualitative and quantitative data. Two annoyingly similar words, which refer to two quite different things, but they're forms of data that work together. And to go on in your career, you need to have an appreciation of the way those things work. And to get that appreciation, it's all about practice. It's all about using these things regularly and making sure you keep up with your skills.